Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be talking about Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen and my ongoing attempt to make videos about all the Austen novels so that I can do a big wrap-up video at the end. I really couldn't even venture a guess at how many times I have read Pride and Prejudice before this read. I would definitely consider it a very formative book for myself in forming my tastes and getting me to think about literature a little bit differently when I was a younger reader. And it's a book that I can continually come back to throughout my life, and it always offers a little bit more. So Austen said herself about Pride and Prejudice, "The work is rather too light, bright, and sparkling. It wants shade." And I think that's an ongoing theme with Austen, who is an Ironist, and there's a lot of humor in her work. There's this idea that those features make it sort of unserious. But that's certainly not the case for anyone who's spent some time with Austen. There's a lot of depth in her works, and she kind of undersells herself in the way she talks about the work, which is perhaps her being ironic about her ironic works. But the irony and the humor is a way to process these societal complexities and these big feelings in a way that feels manageable. So all of that is just another layer on top of a lot of depth and a lot of complexity. And if it didn't have all of that within this work, I don't think it would have had the staying power and the popularity. And I mean, it's a really good reread for a reason. And that's, I think, true of all of Austen novels. They remain very fresh despite the expansive time between herself and us as modern readers. Despite how many times you might have read the book before, there's still that spark in it. So I think of the Austen novels, Pride and Prejudice definitely gets the most of that light, happy tale kind of label on it. And there is a lot of irreverence and humor. We get a nice, happy ending. But I think the reason why Pride and Prejudice feels like the clearest example of that is because it is an Ironist in Austen writing about a character who also sees the world with a lot of irony and humor. Austen likes to sort of laugh at everything and pick on sort of the inconsistencies of human behavior. And Elizabeth is just the same way. She dearly loves to laugh. So our primary perspective into the story, Elizabeth Bennet, seems the most similar of the Austen heroines to the authorial voice. So there's these kind of double layers to it. There's a way to read this where that irony and that humor is a tool for surviving and enjoying your life in an unjust world. So every joke and laugh and smile that is produced by this work is very earned by the skill of the writer. I think comedy versus drama, comedy is a difficult thing to master. And we see that reflected in Elizabeth Bennet and how she has to work to sort of be able to see the world the way she does. And we see that work kind of evolve as she grows in depth and character throughout the novel. You know, I talked about in my Sense and Sensibility video that Eleanor doesn't really change at all over the course of the novel. She's kind of perfect from the beginning, but Elizabeth does have a trait that she needs to change. She needs to grow into this better version of herself. So the whole situation of the entail and 5 daughters having their home and their father's livelihood entailed away from them is a pretty serious issue. I think this is not something many modern readers think about because inheritance and our ideas around that have changed a lot since then. But it was a matter of survival to marry. So maybe that's something that Austen's contemporaries might have felt the seriousness of more, especially when Elizabeth rejects Mr. Collins despite the security and safety that that position would offer her. And then when she rejects Darcy with his first proposal. And with all of this, there's a kind of helplessness. She's of sort of this gentleman's class where it doesn't seem like she can go backwards and work. There's a ton of work options for women, but she couldn't even do the ones that are available. But she also can't inherit enough to live on. So as a woman, she has no options here. So what can she do besides try to find the light in her situation, the light in her life? It really feels like a coping mechanism. And we see in the latter half of the book, Elizabeth gets more serious and she feels these very big feelings. And we see it acknowledged in the book that there's actual effort going into expressing those feelings through humor. So like the part where she's telling Jane about Darcy's letter to her after the failed proposal. And Elizabeth is like sort of flippant about it in that moment. And Jane says something like, "You couldn't possibly have treated the subject this way when you first read this letter." And no, Elizabeth didn't treat it that way. She was very distressed and overcome by her emotions initially. So she really has to work to process her grief and her feelings in this way. And really it becomes a more admirable trait for the work that she puts into getting to that point, which just feels like a really good reflection on Austen as a writer as well. So humor can kind of detach Elizabeth from her feelings. In some ways that's a benefit, and in other ways it is to her detriment. But I think we see that too in Austen's style of writing, that humor can sort of detach those big, dramatic, strong feeling moments. But that doesn't mean those feelings are not there. And that is the same for Elizabeth. She still has those feelings. And I think the fact that Austen doesn't linger on those great proclamations of love and those effusions of emotions, she tends to shorten that and give an overview and not give us all the details. I think her tendency to do that, you almost feel those feelings more strongly. Like they're so big, you don't even need to address them that directly. Yeah, that's been sort of, it's an interesting way to look at Pride and Prejudice, as Elizabeth's worldview being similar to Austen's herself. So Pride and Prejudice supplies us with some of the funniest, absurd side characters of the Austen universe, in my opinion. Mrs. Bennet in particular is such a funny character to me. She really cracks me up at every opportunity. And she's an excellent example of just sort of letting your character talk, like letting that character just exist and fill some space, and they make the joke for themselves. There's not a lot of commentary needed to make Mrs. Bennet funny. Remember when I was in undergrad, I was in a Jane Austen survey course, and we had an assignment with Pride and Prejudice to write a letter from an imagined perspective of one of the characters. And I picked Mrs. Bennet because I think her voice is very distinctive and relatively easy to replicate. And part of that is because there are so many samples of her voice in this book. Mrs. Bennet gets like a lot of talking time. And the way that feels in reading it, it's like Mrs. Bennet has come alive and she will be heard on the pages of this book, you know, despite Austen herself and despite Elizabeth Bennet, who often would rather her mother be silent. But I mean, there's just so many funny moments with her towards the end when she finds out that Elizabeth and Darcy are engaged, and she spent like the entire book just abusing Darcy to his face, and then the second she hears that he's going to marry her daughter, it's, oh my gosh, the finery, oh, the clothes, the carriages you're gonna have, oh dear Darcy. So, I mean, of the funny Austen characters, Mrs. Bennet is one of my favorites. And I do think we have a kind of begrudging love for Mrs. Bennet. She's ridiculous, and obviously Austen does not approve of her general impropriety, but at least it comes from a motive that we can understand, in that she is very scared about the status of the entailment and what that means for her daughter's survival, and she wants to see them well married, which is not such an absurd desire, even though she goes about it in a crazy way. Another very funny character who I don't really think we have any particular love for, but he is there, is Mr. Collins. And he's sort of in the same vein that when Austen just gives Mr. Collins space to talk, you know, he's very chatty in his own way. He makes the joke of himself. And his voice is also very distinctive. All of the Austen characters are so distinctive, and from novel to novel, I don't think she really repeats these archetypes very much. Even her kind of silly characters who aren't going to change or develop throughout the course of the book, they're all very unique in and of themselves. But I love the Mr. Collins letters that pop up throughout this book. They're always very funny. And the whole proposal scene with Elizabeth, I mean, there's a reason that Mr. Collins has like a fan favorite place of, you know, the absurd character, I think, for a lot of Austen readers. He gives us so much to work with. And he's like a perfect character match for Lady Catherine, who is like truly an awful woman, but he like worships at her feet, which is exactly what she wants. It's just people who will worship her. So when they're together or talking about each other, it's very interesting. So I wanted to talk about Wickham a little bit, our iconic Austen villain in Pride and Prejudice. You know, I've pretty recently read Sense and Sensibility, and we have Willoughby in that. So I was already kind of thinking about how these two villains who kind of do similar things, but they are very different, like how they sort of stack up against each other. And then I follow Brandon Taylor on Twitter, who is a great Twitter follow for me. He tweets a lot about books that I'm interested in. But he was recently tweeting about these characters as well, and about how Willoughby is like the absolute worst, completely irredeemable character. I talked about it fairly extensively in my Sense and Sensibility video. But Wickham, I mean, obviously Austen is not forgiving of Wickham, and she gives us no indication that he will ever change his behavior. I mean, he's deeply, deeply selfish, but it's like a kind of villain that we can live with, and the characters do have to live with him because he marries into the family and is sort of part of their lives forever. And then Brandon Taylor pointed out in that tweet that there is sort of a class consciousness kind of thing about Wickham that because of that tweet, I was definitely paying more attention to that in this book, how he is the son of the elder Mr. Darcy's valet, and there's something interesting in there. So he grew up with Darcy, but knowing all along that he would never have the opportunities that Darcy has. So again, you can kind of see maybe some reasons for why Wickham is the way he is, which maybe makes us like 1% more sympathetic to him than Willoughby, who seems like he mostly sucks just because he does. And Wickham is also like a villain in a very entertaining way. Like when him and Lydia finally have their patched up marriage and they come and visit Longbourn before going away, he's still playing this charming game, even though everybody obviously sees through him at that point. He's so casual and at ease. I don't know, it's very funny to see Elizabeth kind of put him in his place a little bit, but not so harshly that it's going to create big issues, because obviously he is in her life now. So Austen's books, they come from a very realistic place. She's writing about female characters of a certain class, and she is writing about the domestic sphere. So we're seeing what's going on in the homes. We're seeing what young ladies of society are doing. So that necessarily limits the options for the perspective a little bit, because we're only seeing the story through the women, and we're seeing the story through what's realistic for women at the time. So especially when everything's happening with Lydia and Wickham, and they're trying to figure out where they are in London, and all of that drama is happening, the story is happening kind of off stage. Obviously Elizabeth is not in London looking for them. We get all of the story by letter, and letters are used like that in Austen often to keep our female characters in the loop on things like this. But it doesn't feel like it makes the story any less immediate. It doesn't seem to materially harm the storytelling. And it's often used as a benefit. Like in this case, the letter writing allows for it to be concealed for a time that Darcy was there for all of this and supporting it. So I don't know, it's like Austen takes something that could be a weakness of the kinds of stories that she's writing, and she really turns it into a benefit. And I was just like, all throughout, there are so many important to the story letters in Pride and Prejudice. And it's such a good way for her to characterize all of these different people. Like we get a letter from Mr. Collins before we even meet him, and obviously his letters are very distinctive. We see Lydia's letter that she wrote upon eloping, which is just so flippant, like you're just like immediately mad at her. And it is through a letter that we first truly get to understand Darcy's character beyond just what we see in the first half of the novel, which is his inclination towards Elizabeth. So I don't know, Austen, she uses that so well in Pride and Prejudice. If you're rereading it or reading it for the first time, definitely pay attention to what the letters are doing, because they carry so much of the story. And I was just like thinking about how efficient she is about that. Because obviously there's a lot of time passing in between these letters, but especially towards the end, she's like compressing all of that time. Because really we don't need to hear about anticipating a letter that often. So it does feel that so much of this book is about the inescapability of family. Both Elizabeth and Darcy have some not so great characters in their family, and they kind of have to learn to accept that if they're going to be together. And of course, initially the focus is on Elizabeth's family, which is deeply flawed. And that is Darcy's initial focus and his hesitancy to embrace his feelings for Elizabeth. But part of the book is kind of discovering what is actually a family problem and what isn't. Like Elizabeth, she has to really learn and reflect on the fact that her sisters and her mother and even her father are often ridiculous and embarrassing and hurting her and Jane's chances at happiness, which is a hard pill to swallow because she loves her family, especially her father. And while those aspects that Darcy disapproves of remain bad, some of the things that he believes to be bad are not the case. Like before he meets the Gardners, it's like just a judgment on their class, their style of living, their work. But when he actually meets them, they are, you know, well-bred and civil and all the things that you would want in your family. And then he has to take a serious look at his own relations in Lady Catherine, who has all of the good breeding and the markers of things that Darcy initially values in this book, but is deeply rude and prideful and like unkind. So I think that's really part of Darcy's journey, especially, is to learn what things to value and sort of all the different shades of class and different levels of being a gentleman, and all of those things add up to less importance than someone's behavior and how informed their mind is, and all of those significantly more important factors. And then, you know, sort of talking about how Elizabeth and Darcy, they both have to grow and change and develop as characters to be able to reach their happy ending with each other. And we kind of see that shifting start in the middle of the book when Darcy first proposes and it goes horribly, and they both kind of have to reflect on themselves a little bit. And I think we see a lot of wisdom in those characters being willing to change, where other characters in the book are not. You know, they both feel some critiques of themselves. They both self-critique, and instead of digging their heels in, they grow and become better versions of themselves. And we can kind of see in each of their families, they each have one person that they are kind of similar towards, who's maybe like the distorted extreme version of each of their kind of fatal flaws. There are like seemingly some readers who kind of treat Darcy like he was perfect the entire time. He was just like really awkward. But no, like he had flaws. They were well discussed what his flaws were. And he was very prideful, and he was very, you know, prejudiced based on class. And it was those concerns that made him so uncivil at the beginning of the book. And the sort of distorted extreme version of that is in his aunt, Lady Catherine. So when his incivility is pointed out to him by Elizabeth, he's like, oh yeah, she's right. I've been really rude. I've been caring about all the wrong things. And I think part of what we're seeing is Darcy doesn't want to be anything like Lady Catherine. So he works on it. And in the latter half of the book, we see him being perfectly civil to the Gardners, genuinely getting to know them. We see him being completely polite and putting in effort into these social interactions that he never would have before. So those are the kind of positive changes that we see in Darcy. And then in Elizabeth, that kind of liveliness and jokiness of her, using humor to sort of cover up her feelings, is kind of the thing that she has to overcome. And that doesn't mean like not being lively and playful. She is obviously still that at the end, but she can't be only that. And the kind of version of that in her family is her father, Mr. Bennet. So Mr. Bennet is definitely more self-aware of his flaw than Lady Catherine. I think that makes him a bit more redeemable, but he's certainly made some mistakes in the way he handles his life. And he's very disconnected from his family and everything that happens in his family because he's just looking for the laugh in it all. So when Jane is like really heartbroken about Mr. Bingley and is going through all of that, he's just looking for the joke in it. And I think Elizabeth, she gets that kind of uncomfortable feeling of, my father shouldn't be acting like this. I know he shouldn't be acting like this, and I don't want to act like this. And one of the big things is that he doesn't respect his wife. He married someone that he can't respect, and he is openly disdainful to her in front of her children. And while it's all a joke in a lot of the book, there's also very serious moments of Elizabeth contemplating how that has affected their entire family. See, that's what I'm saying. Like, the opening chapter of this book is this funny back and forth between Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet, that light, sparkling, fun thing, but there is this shade and depth to that dynamic. So Elizabeth has to be more serious. She has to actually acknowledge and feel her feelings, and she has to respect Mr. Darcy. And respect the people she really cares about. You know, she could never turn Jane into nothing more than a joke because she loves Jane and acknowledges her excellent qualities. So I feel like we really see Elizabeth make a conscious choice to not enter into a marriage and become, you know, the next generation of her father's dynamic. So yeah, after that proposal, they both transform. I think Darcy's is a little more obvious. Elizabeth, we see her change because we see her have these serious moments, which she doesn't really have at all in the first half of the book. And she feels very deeply for Darcy. She feels very deeply about all these things that are happening to her family. And, you know, she knows when is the time to take things seriously. And I think this is all why Darcy and Elizabeth are such a good match and such a couple to root for, is that they're not just two good people who end up together like Eleanor and Edward. They are two good but flawed people who are actively working on those flaws for each other, and they are making each other better people. There is a real transformation from the beginning to the end of this book. Okay, so Pride and Prejudice. This is such a good book to read and reread and reread again. At least it has been for me. I mean, there's so much I didn't discuss, but I hope what I did talk about shows that there's so many layers in Austen's work, layers about how people are, how they exist in the world, with whatever constraints are given to them. I mean, it's a brilliant work. It's a masterpiece. For people who have never read any Austen, it's usually what I suggest as the starting point. Okay, that is all I have for this video. Thanks for watching. Bye.